listeners, and welcome back to the Tango Banter Season 2. This is the first episode of the second season, and as promised, I am diving into a topic I left off with in the last season, which was the topic of feedback and its importance in our growth, both as dancers and in our daily life. If this is your first time joining me on my podcast, welcome. I encourage you to check out the links in the show notes. You might want to sign up for my weekly newsletter, as well as perhaps join my private Facebook group where we get to discuss these topics live during my live banters on Fridays. So if you're interested in joining, please check out the links in the show notes. Now, why is feedback so important? And why is it so difficult? This is what we will be discussing in this episode. And I invite you to reflect on your own experience of feedback, both receiving and giving, and perhaps consider what makes for you constructive, really effective feedback. When have you in the past received feedback that really made a difference significantly in your dance or something else? And where has feedback kind of failed you? Perhaps you've received feedback that actually wasn't very helpful, and maybe you didn't realize it right away. Maybe down the line you realized it wasn't that useful. So bring up those memories in your mind as you're listening to the podcast. And if you'd like to share any of your personal responses or any thoughts on this idea, feel free to reach out to me on social media at I'm So Tango. That's IMSO Tango. Or reach me by email at connect@imsotango.com. Now, in terms of why feedback is so difficult, I will be sharing this from my own personal experience as a teacher for many, many years. I've been in the teaching profession for at least 20 years of my life, everything from academics to yoga to art to tango. And I've also been on the receiving end of feedback in all of those areas as well. And what I think makes feedback so tricky is that, number one, if you're giving feedback, ultimately, you don't really know for sure ever whether what you're saying is actually the correct thing to say to that person. Even recently, I had this experience where I had been working with a student for many, many months. And there was a concept that was fairly simple to me that I kept explaining to her. And she seemed like she understood, but she didn't ultimately. And then after months and months, all of a sudden, she rephrased what I was telling her, and she put it in her own words that to me did not make sense. I didn't understand why my selection of words that I used didn't work for her, but that was the case. I had spent all this time giving her feedback that ultimately was not hitting the right place in her mind. But once she was able to conceptualize it in her own way and understand it in her own way, that's when it was successful. So whenever we give feedback, we're giving it from a place of knowledge within ourselves. And we don't really for sure ever 100% know what the other person is understanding, how they're interpreting. And also, anytime that we give feedback, unconsciously, we come from a place of assumption that the other person understands and has a bank of knowledge that would allow them to interpret your feedback correctly. But that's a lot of times not the case, especially in tango, because a lot of people who come to tango have very, very diverse backgrounds and require different ways of understanding. So it puts us in this interesting position as teachers, as dancers, when we give feedback, that even though we might know something really, really intimately and understand it from all different sides. And of course, we get better with time. We get more efficient and more clear with our feedback. No matter how long we are doing it, though, it remains this unknown. There's this gap that we will never fill because we are not the other person, we are ourselves. So our perspective will be limited. And when we're on the receiving end of feedback, a lot of times we're asking questions to understand something about ourselves that ultimately only we can understand. Only I can understand myself the best, right? No matter how advanced a teacher is that I go to, no matter how many years they've spent in their field, of course, their expertise is useful and they can illuminate a lot of dark areas and blind spots in my mind. However, ultimately, only I can know myself to the degree that is possible to be known. And I can only know that by going through the process of my own study of myself. So it's tempting to go to someone and trust someone else's interpretation of what we're doing wrong or what needs to be done differently. But ultimately, only you can know what you need to do and what is correct or not. So, in this way, feedback, giving and receiving, can be quite tricky. And so, let's talk about what is it that we can do to both give more effective feedback and also how to receive feedback and interpret it in a way that's useful to us. So, of course, when we ask, is feedback necessary at all? The answer is yes. We need feedback, especially in something like tango. It takes two, as we know. And so, whenever we are learning tango or trying to understand new concepts, new movements, new vocabulary, it's really important for us to receive feedback from the other person. And I would say it's important to receive feedback from multiple people because what we end up integrating into our bodies is going to be a consolidation of all the different pieces of feedback that we get from different people. I've found in my years of teaching and studying that the best feedback comes from a place of neutrality. And this is where I think we get into this nitty gritty of feedback in the context of tango. Is that sometimes if we have an emotional attachment to things being a certain way, or we really feel that something needs to urgently change about someone, coming from a place like this doesn't help a lot of times. It actually creates a lot of friction between people. It causes the other person to not necessarily be very receptive. And the result is we might get more emotional in response, which I've been there for sure. So, in understanding my own process of giving feedback, I noticed that my best feedback that I can offer usually comes when I'm really not attached to the other person actually taking it in, which is paradoxical because, of course, there's this desire to help the other person understand something, to answer the questions, to clarify the confusion. But if I am too attached to the person really understanding it, or if I'm too attached to changing something about the other person, I find that the feedback I give doesn't land very well consistently. I have found this to be the case. If I'm not emotionally attached to the result, if I'm not invested in the other person actually taking my feedback and applying it, I find that I have more success with that. So one of the first pieces of advice that I tend to give if somebody asks me about how to give somebody feedback, the first thing that I suggest is that there is an intention to not be attached, not be so invested in the other person actually taking your feedback. Because ultimately, the purpose of feedback is to serve the other person. And I know for me, especially when I was a young teacher, just starting out, I wanted to give feedback all the time. I felt like I was on a mission to save the world and make sure everybody knows the correct way of doing things. But that's really about serving me. That was coming from a place of me wanting to prove and show what I know and prove my expertise and sort of be right, be proven right. After some years and many experiences where I really saw the effect of coming from that place, and it wasn't very positive, I realized that there really isn't anything that I have to tell the other person unless they want to know, unless they ask for it. There's this concept that I hear sometimes that you cannot you cannot teach somebody to be thirsty. You know, I think the saying goes, you can walk the horse to the water, but the horse has to drink the water itself, right? So I think it applies very much in the context of feedback, that when somebody asks you feedback and they have a specific question, that's what you respond to. That's what your service as a person giving feedback is targeted towards. It's not to completely overhaul everything about the person or give them everything that you know about the subject, because this is kind of a fact that I've realized in my own learning of Tango and watching other people in any form of education or class when it comes to especially physical learning movements. You only retain a small percentage of what you receive at one time. It's maybe 10 to 20%, I would guess. So you really want to make sure that that 10 to 20% that the person retains actually is important. And if you give a lot of feedback, touching upon lots of different things, chances are that the person is going to nod their head, but they're not really going to retain it. So my suggestion is always to come from a place of what is the question that the person's asking and speak to that question directly. Now, that also takes us to distinguishing between what is constructive feedback and what is unhelpful criticism, and how to distinguish between the two. As a person giving feedback, I already mentioned that coming from a place of attachment and emotionally being invested in the person becoming something other than they are now. So I'm sort of coming from this place of charge where I really have a problem with how someone's doing something and I really want to fix it. Automatically coming from that place, my feedback might take on a somewhat unhelpful characteristic, that it's not going to resonate with the person on the level that I ultimately want. And as a receiver of feedback, it's important to distinguish between what is helpful feedback and what is just criticism. So if you're on the receiving end, sometimes it's hard to tell whether the feedback you're getting is actually feedback you can use, or is it just unhelpful. And my suggestion is, especially if you're starting out and you are going to lots of different teachers, is to pay attention to how you feel in response to the feedback and trust your gut and your intuition on that, because ultimately as I said, you're the only one who really knows whether the feedback you're receiving is useful or not. So if it feels like it's not useful, you don't have to take it. I've met so many dancers who really love studying with different teachers, and they swear by certain methodologies, and they're very excited about the instruction that they're getting. But then when I listen to them talk about their own dance, I hear them say, well, I need to fix this, and this is wrong, and this is wrong. And there's this whole list of things that never seems to get shorter. And the need to keep going to a teacher and keep getting feedback doesn't seem to go down. And to me, one of the qualities of constructive feedback that's actually helpful is that over time, it diminishes your need to go get feedback. I think as dancers, a lot of times we're so ready to just take on the feedback, whatever that's given to us, without really considering whether it's applicable. Now, again, going back to this idea of where are we starting from when we're giving or receiving feedback, it's such a powerful element to understand and be aware of, because it dictates so much of what we end up interpreting about ourselves or about the other person. I've talked about this in other contexts before, that the mind is an amplifying machine. So whenever I am in a state of negativity and I start to assess another person, whether it's a dancer or someone else, and I start seeing things that are wrong, my mind will amplify it and multiply it. And then before long, I have a whole list of things that I don't like. And this sometimes happens on the dance floor if I'm in a really bad mood, or if my body's just not feeling well, and I start dancing with somebody who does not have proper technique or good technique, and I'm not able to really be in a presence of mind to kind of be generous and accommodate and sort of have a good time despite that. My mind will go into overdrive, and I will just nitpick in my mind all the things that I don't like about that person. The same thing can happen as a receiver of feedback. If I go in, which I had the experience that I shared in previous episodes, where I went to some privates with a few teachers a while back, and no matter how much feedback they gave me and how helpful they were trying to be, I was coming in with an attitude that there's something fundamentally wrong with me that needs to be fixed. And it didn't matter how generous they were with their praise of my accomplishments or how much other people enjoyed dancing with me. This place of lack that I was coming from automatically put me in a place where I constantly was fixing something else about myself. And in that case, the feedback I was receiving was not useful, but it wasn't because of the teachers. It was because anything that I heard, it was like a filter in my mind. Whatever was positive, I accepted it and just sort of let it fly away. Whatever was negative, I latched onto as, see, that thing is wrong with me and I need to fix it. So it's a tricky thing to catch yourself. And that would be my first question to you when you reflect on some of the positive feedback you've given or you've received, and some of the negative or less helpful feedback that you received. Where were you at the time? What emotional place were you coming from? So having spent many, many years giving feedback, I want to share some of my insights that I've started using with my students that I feel have been the most successful for me as a teacher. And I've also applied this in other areas of my life, and any time that somebody asks me for help or advice or opinion, this is my process. And I'd love to hear if you have your own process that you have developed, or if you have something to add to this discussion. Because it's so important to start from a place of acceptance and generosity when giving feedback, I try to the best of my ability, no matter what level the student is at when they come to me, I try to approach them as a complete and whole person, perfect as they are, not needing to change in any way. So, number one is this attitude that nothing needs to change. Maybe factually speaking, yes, things have to change. Maybe it's a beginner and they need to develop certain skill sets. That's there. But in my mind, I tell myself today, if this was the last day that I ever saw them, and if this was the last day they danced tango or did yoga or anything, that I basically accept who they are as they are right now, and they don't need to be anything different. That's number one. Then I really wait for the question, for the actual thing that they really want to understand right now. And that's an important piece, because sometimes they don't even know what they need to know. They don't have a question when they come to you. And in that case, it's easy to just start throwing feedback left and right, and touching upon this and that thing, and this needs to change. And then we're sort of tweaking. And by the end of it, the person probably is so confused and they have thousands of things they're thinking about all at once. And I think that kind of mindset ends up being fruitless in terms of personal growth and integration. So even if the person doesn't have a question at the moment when they come to me, my job before giving feedback is to get a clear sense of what exactly they need help with, and be as specific as possible addressing that particular issue, whatever that issue is in the moment that you decide. So, in the grand scheme of things, the person is perfect as they are. And what I'm doing when I'm offering feedback is I'm just throwing some confetti on it. I'm just topping the cake with some icing, putting a cherry on top. It's a full, complete package already. And I'm just helping that person to become even better. That's the mindset that I have. And I do feel like it really changes how dancers think about themselves when I come from this approach, especially when I have beginners or somebody who doesn't feel very confident in themselves. I frequently will emphasize to them that they are a full-formed dancer in their own right, developing their dance the way an artist would be developing their art. So we are colleagues, we are collaborators in them improving who they are as dancers and helping them go to the next level. I'm not, let's say, rushing in to help them fix what's wrong so that they can be okay and help them feel better about themselves because they're coming from a place of lack. I hope you feel the difference in that approach and how those two things are quite opposite, I would say. Now, the other piece about feedback that's really key is timing. And I think timing is the second most influential piece that dictates whether the feedback is going to land correctly and whether it's going to make the impact that you want it to make. Of course, we all know that feedback on the social dance floor is a big no-no. So that should be kind of understood. But then, in terms of when you're practicing with someone, or you're in a lesson with someone, you're teaching someone, or you're working with a teacher, when is the appropriate time to receive feedback, for how long, and how do you decide? And that, to me, once again, goes back to have specific questions. I find that my most difficult moments of feedback, as on the receiving end, when I've received feedback in the past, has been about timing. Sometimes someone in my life is rushing in to give me feedback that I'm absolutely not asking for, not prepared for, and they feel that it's their right, it's their duty to tell me that I'm doing something wrong right away, because otherwise something might not happen correctly in the world, you know? And to me, feedback is meant to help, to serve the person who needs it. And it goes back to that sentiment that if you rush in with all this emotionality and you have all of this feedback to give because you're so urgently need to change the other person, chances are it's the wrong time to give feedback. In fact, to me, this has become my rule, that any time that I actually feel those emotions, when I'm feeling negative, if I'm feeling sort of cranky and offended even by someone's bad technique or the way they move, that's the moment that I really resist giving feedback, because this is the marker of the wrong time. If there's emotionality, it's the wrong time to give feedback. There are other times when the feedback is not appropriate. This is a more personal opinion and kind of how I've decided to proceed with my own methods. So take it with a grain of salt. But anytime that a person actually comes to me and says something like, if there's anything wrong with my dance, can you tell me? Like, especially if we're in a practica setting and it's a beginner and somebody, they start dancing with me and we're not necessarily working on anything specific. We're just dancing. And maybe if it's even the first time we're dancing and they know I'm a teacher, they'll say, even if you feel anything that's wrong, just tell me so I can fix it, or it'll be that kind of sentiment. And on the surface, it's there's nothing wrong with that, right? They want to improve. They know I'm a teacher. They respect my opinion. But at the same time, people who ask me for feedback in that way are also people who are always asking for feedback and who are constantly receiving feedback from different people, and they want more and more and more of it. So in those cases, I don't actually think that anything that I offer will land, because there's already an oversaturation. However, if somebody tells me, same scenario, in a practica setting, somebody takes the embrace and they say, hey, I'm working on this thing. Can you tell me if I am actually doing this thing that I'm practicing? That's very different. Do you see the difference there? That on one hand, the first example, there is no question. It's just a state of being where the person just wants feedback because they're trying to make sure they're okay. They're trying to make sure that they satisfy the demands that they perceive I might have, or they perceive other dancers have. In the second example, there's something very concrete that somebody's working on, and they want my help to detect whether it's working or not. So I tend to shy away from requests for feedback that are very vague and kind of ambiguous. Just tell me if there's anything wrong with me. That kind of feedback, I don't really respond to. The other timing that's not so great for giving feedback is when you can tell the other person is really enjoying themselves and they're not paying attention to anything technical. They're not in that state of mind. They're really in the state of mind of dancing. It is the worst time to bust in with some feedback in that moment. And I tell you, I've worked with some people who are exactly like that. They would do that to me, that when I was in a total state of flow and really enjoying myself, they would burst in to tell me that I was doing something wrong and I need to shift it. And they might be right. The feedback itself might be correct, but I am not in a place of receiving it. And in that state, when somebody's really enjoying themselves and you bust in with some feedback, there's going to be one of three things that will happen. And these are the three things that happen, I think, anytime feedback comes from a place of urgency or trying to fix the other person. The other person is either going to shut down and sort of disconnect and not necessarily be present the same way. They might put a guard up and they might sort of cinch in their energy and not really express themselves very much, which I've done. They might resist your feedback and argue with you and question whether you really know what you're talking about. Or they're just going to accept it and feel really bad about themselves. And I've done all of those on the receiving end as a student. I have experienced all of those responses. I don't know why it's so palpable to me when someone gives me feedback from that place of negative charge or some sort of attachment to the outcome. But anytime I get feedback that I can tell comes from that place, I automatically want to resist. Even if they're right, even if down the line, I'm going to go back to their comment and think, oh, you know what? They were correct. I still, in that moment, can't quite accept it. There's a fight in me there, and I've never been able to get rid of it. And now, having been teaching for a really long time and kind of being on this other journey of giving feedback to people, I understand that this is really the key. That if I don't come from a place of just total neutrality, like, you can take my feedback if you want, you don't have to, you can continue doing what you're doing, you can go get a second opinion, totally fine. That's when the person is going to be the most likely to let down their guard and accept and be responsive and be receptive. Now, there are cases maybe when you are coming from a place of neutrality and you don't care whether the person takes the feedback or not. And let's say that the other person is resisting your feedback and they're not really agreeing with it and they don't think that it's the right answer. What do you do in that case? Well, very simple. You move on. You don't insist on it. That's really, to me, has been a great relief to be able to do that. It also makes me let go of my ego a little bit, because the ego wants to persist and wants to prove that you're right. You are the one with the answer. But to me, if nowadays, if somebody, even in the context of a private session, somebody who comes to me for advice, for feedback on particular issues, if I get resistance from them and some sort of argument or explanation why they do certain things versus others, I just go along with it. And I kind of say, well, if this works for you, great. This is just my opinion. If you don't want to do it this way, totally fine. And really mean it. I think that's the key, to really mean it. Now, personally, this has been my observation that when I work with men in particular, I get this more than when I work with women. When men come to me for help with leading, especially, and I give them feedback, a lot of times they will try to justify, explain to me why they're doing certain things and defend their decisions. And so a lot of my session is spent either explaining why I believe something is a certain way, or me just sort of nodding my head and thinking, why are you coming to me then if you don't want to take this in? So there's a little bit of that ego that I experience from men in particular. And I don't know whether it's because I'm a woman, and when men work with women, perhaps there's a little bit of that feeling of like, that there's a little bit of an ego issue, or that women are a little bit more open as a rule, just naturally. They're more receptive to feedback, and maybe women working with other women creates a different dynamic. So I'd be curious to hear from all of you out there if you have an opinion on this. I do believe there's a difference there just in the gender dynamics. And to be honest, I've actually stopped working with men for a while because of that, because I was having a really tough time in the sessions of actually convincing them to listen to the feedback that I was giving, even though they were asking for it. A lot of times it's like they would come to me and want to show off about what they know. Like they want to impress me with their knowledge. And if there's that energy, if somebody's coming into me with that sort of boundary, that guard up, where they don't want to be vulnerable, they want to just show off and be present in a certain way, to me, that is a place where I'm like, well, I can't help you. Go to someone else. Go to someone that really allows you to relax and take it in. So trust is a big issue there, I'm sure. Now, let's say that you are dealing with somebody who is very receptive to feedback and you're not having to deal with the resistance at all. What kind of feedback should you be giving? How much of it? How do you structure it? To me, especially when it comes to tango, I try to make my feedback as palpable and concrete physically as possible, meaning that whatever I'm dealing with, I want the person to actually feel on a physical level what I'm saying rather than understand it conceptually. So one of my big rules for giving feedback is to make sure that I explain the concept, but then there's a lot of time to really move and practice the concept physically and not move on until I feel that the person got it. And on a tactile level, it's very clear when somebody suddenly understands something. Within one session that I work with someone, I don't give more than, let's say, 3 pieces of feedback. And 3 is kind of pushing it. Sometimes I even stick with just 1. And those 3 things that I talk about, I typically like to keep them close together so that they're connected. So if I'm working with somebody on the embrace, a particular aspect of the embrace, maybe it's the closed side of the embrace or the open side of the embrace, I'm not going to next talk about the feet or the alignment of the hips. I'm not going to give feedback on musicality. If I'm talking about embrace, my feedback needs to stay around the embrace as much as possible. Even if I diverge to something else, what I think about is, how can I present the information so the person can deduce it themselves later? So it's like I want to create a little map for someone. So if they don't understand a particular concept, and we start by exploring a particular aspect of the dance, that every piece of feedback I give is meant like a little crumb that they can follow on their own afterwards. And so you might not be in a setting where you're actually teaching someone. You might be in a setting where you're giving feedback to a practice partner, or you're consistently working with someone, you're getting together with them once a week or something like that, and you're working on a particular vocabulary. My suggestion would be to focus on 1 to 3 things that are related, and to not move on from this one thing that you start with, to not move on until the other person asks another question. And that kind of brings me to this other side of the process, right? On the one hand, I'm the one sort of crafting the map that the other person can use later to arrive at the information once they leave. On the other hand, I'm listening for the person's questions. And those questions are so key. It's so important to hear, to really hear the question and how the question is being asked. Because sometimes someone will ask you the question and you'll have this idea of how you need to respond, but you'll respond from a different perspective. Maybe they're asking you about something very specific about the embrace, and you start talking about the alignment of the spine. They ask you about the sizes of steps and what size step it needs to be in a certain figure, and you go in to talk about the whole figure and the whole sequence and why the whole thing works the way it does. You basically want to make it as close as possible to where that person is in the moment. Like your answer needs to really match where the person's coming from. And this is because when we look back where I started this banter, and I said, the difficulty is that we are never really sure what we know about the other person, because what we know really comes just from us. I can only know myself to this degree. I can't know the other person. And then from the other person's perspective, only they can know for sure if the feedback is valuable. So both people really need to have the intention of really finding the closest place where that gap is between them, right? Where we want to close the gap as much as possible in understanding, and be specific about what are we actually talking about, what is really happening, what language are we using? Are we using the same terminology the same way, or does this person understand a certain principle differently? That happens so much, I tell you. I think 90% of what I do as a teacher is just clarifying, because a lot of dancers come to me and they regurgitate certain phrases that they were taught, but they don't actually understand what those phrases mean. And so I feel like my job is to find out exactly where the confusion is, and then help them to understand the concept that they've probably learned years ago, and they already have a conceptual understanding of it, but they don't quite understand how it translates into the body. So the more you can first keep it very specific. So if you're working with somebody, just to really keep the number of things you're working on down to a minimum. If you can just work on one thing for an hour, great. That actually would be amazing. Most people get bored with that and they want to stick something else in, and that's fine, but keep it within the same realm. And then really look and wait for the questions to come from the other person before you continue to give feedback. Because a lot of times the questions will illuminate whether the person actually understands the concept or not. And if they don't, this is kind of the the third part of the challenge. If somebody doesn't understand your feedback and they're resisting you not because they don't want to understand it or because they're sort of have something against it, it's just because something doesn't make sense to them. It's your job to find a different way to explain it. It's not on them to understand it. And it's very humbling because sometimes you're like, God, why can't they understand? This is so simple and it's so basic. And I can just visualize my father screaming at me, trying to teach me math when I was little. And I think he thought if he was just speaking louder and louder, I would suddenly understand it. But it doesn't work that way. It really is on the feedback giver to explain it in a different way while remaining completely neutral. When somebody doesn't understand something or they're resisting it for whatever reason, it's very easy for us to get frustrated, emotional, get upset. But really, we are serving, when we're giving feedback, we are serving the other person. So it's our job to rephrase. So, what are signs of successful feedback? How do you know that the feedback that you gave was good, was helpful, that the person actually benefited from it? Well, you might not know right away. That's fine. I think if there's a place of detachment that you're coming from already, and that you continue to interact with the person without any emotionality about them getting it or not, that already makes it successful. And granted, you might have to give this feedback again and again and again and again. That's just part of this process. It's very interesting why it happens this way. I don't know why it takes so long for someone to really understand and get it. But even with me, with some of my students, I would have someone come the first, second session, I'd be giving them feedback on a certain piece. And then 10 sessions later, suddenly they're like, oh, I get it. This thing that you were saying weeks ago. So you want to be generous and realize that with all of the expertise that you might have and all of the best techniques that you might have in your arsenal for giving feedback, you might be a really great communicator and a really great teacher. Ultimately, the person's going to learn when they need to learn. It's not up to you. But I will say that for me, I know that the feedback is helpful when my students or whoever I'm giving feedback to comes back to me and actually reports something specific. A lot of times they'll say, I was dancing with this person. I heard your voice in my head and I did this thing and then that happened. And so to me, that's a marker like, okay, it worked. But outside of that, it's a very gradual process. And in this way, once again, feedback is a service. It's not meant for the benefit of the person who's giving the feedback. It's really for the person receiving it. So we don't need to be very attached to what happens afterwards. We just need to do what is best in this moment for the other person. Now, one way I want to encourage all of you to think about it too is that by the end of the session, whatever the session is where you're giving feedback, maybe it's just a tanda worth, by the end of that, I always want the person who received feedback from me to leave more empowered and feeling better about their dance rather than leaving with a list of things and to-dos that they have to fix. So to me, the sense of empowerment that we can impart to someone by saying, you know what, you're not that far away from being as good as you want to be. You're almost there. You're 99% there. We're just tweaking things, you know. Even a beginner, I sometimes will tell the beginners who come to me and say, you already know the basics. We're just now going to be fine-tuning things. Even if they think they have so much to work on, I always bring them back to this sense of like, we're colleagues. I've just been doing this for a little bit longer than you. So here is my contribution to your journey. So to me, that will be a great mindset to have when you are giving feedback, to make sure that the other person leaves elevated and leaves empowered. So to wrap up this little banter about feedback, I would say mindset is key. For many things about Tango, we're really learning that in different ways, that our mindset dictates a lot of our experiences. So I encourage you not to shy away from feedback, from giving feedback and receiving, but also being mindful of the timing of when you give feedback, what emotional state you're in when you give feedback. Those pieces really contribute to the other person feeling good about themselves when they leave and wanting to come back and work with you again. And that mindset of the other person being perfect as they are, I think is a really key mindset to adopt. And I encourage you to practice it and think about your own experience. Like I said at the beginning of the episode, those instances when you got really great feedback from someone, just think what that felt like and whether you could tell that perhaps they had those same similar qualities where they really saw you as a complete dancer already and they were adding to the arsenal of tricks and tools that you have versus trying to fix something about you. So thanks so much for joining me for this banter. It's good to be back. I hope you join me next week, because next week I will be debuting a pilot episode that I recorded with Alex, my now husband, and it will be really fun to share that episode with you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode, and if you have anything to add, make sure you message me and share your thoughts. Until next week, ciao.